On this edition of the Newsmakers, the cost of frontline access. Are militaries distorting how journalists report on war? Also on today's program, stepping into the spotlight, the acid attack victim sending a message from the catwalk. And picture this, 2 more earthquakes hit a part of Italy still shaken from August's deadly quake. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Now, for centuries, reporters have filed dispatches from the front lines of war. And with the growth of television, it seems reporters are getting ever closer to the action. Embedding with soldiers is now standard practice for many war reporters, but it comes at a cost. The military controls where reporters go and most of what they see. And just as journalists use the military to get access, militaries use the media to tell their side of the story. Our newsmaker today is the military's relationship with the media, as we ask who needs whom more and if their collaboration is ethical.
24 hours ago, this mound was controlled by Daesh, so we're right on the front line. Now, these Kurdish Peshmerga fighters are using it to repel the terrorists even further.
Vice News travelled to Iraq with the Golden Division, Iraq's special forces, as they launched an offensive against the Islamic State in the western province of Anbar.
The push to retake the city of Mosul with the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. Euronews correspondent Mohammed Sheikh Ibrahim is embedded with the elite troops.
Reporting from the battlefields often means you have to be embedded with the military. More often than not, journalists swap editorial independence for security, access to information, and pictures. For the militaries involved, embedding journalists is a way of taking control, as the vast majority of images don't show the other side of war.
This country's first tentative
The Gulf War in the early 90s ushered in a new era of reporting, as 24-hour news brought real-time video of battles into living rooms around the world for the first time.
in this blood-soaked country.
2 decades later, journalists are using social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube.
We've had a unit that's now as close as 5 miles away from Mosul.
Changing the dynamics of conflict reporting. Even mainstream media live stream from the front line, giving the latest information about the course of war given to them by the military. Embedded journalism has become the standard for reporting on conflicts. It allows journalists to get good stories. But are they the right stories? Christine Pirovoulakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Islamabad is Sultan Hali. He's a journalist and TV show host who previously served in the Pakistani Air Force. And from London, Paul Martin, also a journalist who's worked in war zones across the Middle East. Thanks both so much for joining us. Paul Martin, let me begin with you. As a journalist, tell us what you find wrong with embedded reporting in conflict zones.
Well, a journalist should be independent and free to act wherever he can or she can. Obviously, there are dangerous parts of a war zone that journalists need to protect themselves from bullets and bombs. And in that sense, it can be an advantage to be with a military unit because they know how to protect you in certain situations. However, in terms of genuine journalism, it is far, far better not to be beholden to any group or part of a war, but to report on the war as objectively and fairly as you can. Being embedded doesn't help that.
So, Paul, do you think integrity is actually compromised and it poses a real conflict of interest?
It does pose a conflict of interest. There can be excellent reporting as an embedded journalist. There are several examples of this which I've seen in my own career where people have come up with very good stories because they were embedded. For example, in Nasiriyah during the Iraq war, the American invasion of Iraq, there was very good reporting on the front lines from an embedded journalist, but there are also horrible examples of journalists becoming sucked in to the action that's going on. There was a woman journalist in that same war on a warship, American warship, who was saying, and, oh, good luck, boys, as they were taking off, and things like that. It is not the role of a journalist to look to be on one side or the other. I'm glad to say that woman journalist was, in fact, eventually removed from the warship because she was not being objective. But it does lend itself to being too identified with the people you're with.
Okay. Sultan Ali, do you think a journalist's integrity can be compromised via being embedded with the military in war zones?
Yeah, definitely. You see, as pointed out, that embedded journalism has its plus points, but the downside is that, you see, the journalist who is embedded can become over-dependent upon the people who are protecting him or her, and also get biased in reporting, and try and give out the positive aspects, which was obviously the initial aim of the military, because they would like only the positive aspects to be reported, and their mistakes and gross errors to be hidden. So therefore, the embedded journalist suffers from this dilemma, whether to report correctly or sometimes inadvertently report what is being fed to him or her by the host.
But Sultan, correct me if I'm wrong, you do overall think embedding is a positive thing, and it is most often a very good relationship between the military and reporters.
You see, as I said, embedded journalism definitely has its plus points. But here the important factor should be that the journalist who is being embedded should be mature. She should be so much knowledgeable that he or she does not get swayed by the opinion of the military, instead is reporting the facts as they are. As long as the journalist can maintain this balance, it will be ideal.
And then how difficult is it? I mean, when you're expected to write honest criticism about what these military contingents and the governments they're serving are doing, when, first of all, they're responsible for your very safety, and you're on the road with them in very close quarters for days at a time. Sometimes a personal bond is formed.
I have noticed some aspects in the war on terror. What happens is that, speaking from personal example, I've seen there was a siege and there were journalists who were supposed to be kind of embedded. In fact, they had the protection of the military, but they were also in direct contact with the terrorists, and as such, they were being fed by the by the terrorists, and at times they were giving out information which was compromising the operation itself, and at other times they got so swayed because the terrorists were calling them up with very harrowing tales of how they were being targeted, and so these journalists started taking sides. So that is something which is extremely dangerous and needs to be watched out for.
Okay, Paul, go ahead.
Well, I was going to give you an example of what I think is bad journalism. I already said, when people say we are under attack, we are being shelled, for example. That's quite a common phrase you see among embedded journalists or journalists traveling with the military. I've just seen this a few days ago. It's completely wrong, because it's not whoever's fighting the group that you're with is not attacking you. They're attacking the particular group, and you shouldn't make it a personal issue. They're not trying to kill you. They're trying to fight a war. And once you start crossing that dividing line, then you really are in trouble, in my view, as an independent journalist. You've lost your independence.
But then, Paul, tell us what alternative there is here. How can you best cover conflict without dangerously risking your personal safety?
Well, as you know, for example, in the Iraq War, I'm giving one example, in the Bosnian War, the majority of journalists that were covering the war were probably not embedded, and they produced very fine journalism. And journalists themselves are targeted, you're quite right, whether they are inside a military unit. In that case, they're probably not being personally targeted, or sometimes you get attacked because you are a journalist. I drove across the airport in Sarajevo, which had three different militant groups, three different fighting groups around the airport, and I had a bullet hole between the T and the V of the TV written on the side of my vehicle that I was using, on the left-hand side, fired by one group, and when I got back, I found another bullet hole on the other side, fired by the opposite group. So both of them probably were annoyed with journalism in general or one particular broadcaster, and took it out on on the poor journalist driving across the airport.
Okay.
So journalists do get attacked when they're independent. That's just a risk you have to run.
Let me ask Sultan quickly, though. Do print journalists have a bit of an advantage, or actually I should say a disadvantage here? Or no, excuse me. Do print journalists have an advantage because they aren't beholden to the images that they need, that the embed most easily gets them? Sultan, go ahead.
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, definitely the print journalist does have this advantage. But you see, the story cannot go out unless it is supported with images. And if you're not on the front scene, if you're not having visuals, or if you're not supported by images, then the story remains incomplete, and you'll probably not be able to report as objectively as is required of a true journalist.
Okay, Paul, go ahead on that same topic. Do you feel you're at an advantage because you aren't beholden
Yes.
to the images that you get through the military?
Well, that is true, that once you are with the military, you're getting literally the image they want you to see, whereas you can point your camera in different directions and go on different types of stories when you're independent. So you can choose more accurately the kind of stories and film what you need to film. However, of course, you can get closer to the action usually if you are embedded. On the other hand, you can get stuck. I had one friend of mine when I was covering the war in Iraq for a newspaper who was in an embedded situation, and her unit just got stuck in one particular part of Iraq, and she couldn't do anything for days and days and days while I was producing good stories. So it has some advantages and some disadvantages in terms of the actual images you can pick up and the access you can get. And in general, I'd far rather be able to film the kind of story that I see as it develops, as it changes, rather than be stuck with one particular unit.
Okay, Sultan, just a final question for you. Coming from the military perspective yourself, give us a sense of what it means to be in the military and to have to cater to these journalists within your unit.
Well, let me give you a quote from Lieutenant General Brady, who was the Director General of the Public Affairs for the U.S. forces during the Gulf War in 1991. And he said that the task of reporting on a war is too serious to be left to the journalist. The military must have a say. So having said that, I tend to agree that the military actually is very cautious. You see, surprise is one of the first principles of war, and the general or the commanding officer of a unit is very scared that the journalist may enable the enemy to lose, for the friendly forces to lose the element of surprise by letting out something which may be compromising the operation. So the military, that is why they like to have a control over the journalist. But having adopted the profession of journalism, I realize that the journalist is independent, doesn't like to be shackled by the military, and tends to, report independently. Now, having said that, let me bring it to a concluding point that actually the military and the media, they both need each other. The military has a story to tell, the media can tell it very well. And if the military can employ the media properly, it can actually become a force multiplier, and it can be a win-win situation for both sides.
Okay, Sultan Ali, I'll give you the last word. Thanks so much for joining us there from
Can I just
Islamabad. Paul, go ahead, say what you were going to say.
Oh, I was going to say, I just hate the idea of us being considered a force multiplier or a good, useful tool in the military armory. It is true that war has several fronts, not just the firing of artillery, but also how you portray it. But we must refuse to allow the armies of the world to use us as a form of warfare. We have to be their objective, fair, independent, and battle ourselves against the temptation to be sucked in by one side or the other.
Okay, Paul Martin, we'll let you have the last word there. I'd like to thank both Sultan Ali and Paul Martin for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the Newsmakers, we talk to the woman helping the survivors of acid attacks in India. And in picture this, a double earthquake in Italy that's caused damage and devastation. Now, there are over 1,000 acid attacks every year around the world, many of them a form of revenge or jealousy. The victims are left scarred for life, but now they're getting inspiration from an unusual place. Natalie Pohonen has more.
Changing the face of beauty. Reshma Qureshi stunned on the catwalk at New York Fashion Week, turning heads and perceptions from the runway.
तो मैं दुनिया को ये मैसेज देना चाहती हूँ कि मतलब जैसे मैं चल रही हूँ, मतलब वही लड़कियाँ नहीं हैं जो मतलब सब कुछ कर सकती हैं, हम भी हैं जो दुनिया में सब कुछ कर सकते हैं। इसलिए मैं सबको ये मैसेज दूँगी कि जो इनके साथ में हुआ है प्लीज़ उसको ऐसी नज़र से ना देखें, सबको एक ही नज़र से देखें।
2 years ago, Qureshi was living a normal life in Mumbai, but she lost an eye and suffered severe burns after her estranged brother-in-law and 2 men attacked her with sulfuric acid. She's since become a prominent advocate for Indian survivors and is part of a campaign for NGO Make Love Not Scars to ban the availability of acid.
रेड लिपस्टिक आपको आसानी से कहीं भी मिल जाएगी, एसिड की तरह, जिसकी वजह से हर रोज एक लड़की एसिड अटैक की विक्टिम बनती है।
About 1,500 acid attacks are reported worldwide each year. That figure could be much higher, with many victims too scared or ashamed to come forward. India has the highest number of attacks, which are often carried out as a form of revenge. But Qureshi hopes her catwalk success will inspire survivors to move forward in their lives. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Mumbai is Riya Sharma. She is the founder of Make Love Not Scars, an organization set up to help the victims of acid attacks. Riya, thanks so much for joining us. First, tell us a little bit more about how this epidemic actually first developed and when you decided you needed to get involved.
Hi, thanks for having me. I think acid attacks stem from, we have a problem with male domination in our country. And I think that's where acid attacks normally stem from because, anytime a woman tries to progress further, she is punished. And I think acid attacks are a way of punishing a woman. The Indian community also kind of believes that the woman's place in society is judged solely based on her appearances as well. So, when a man destroys her appearances, he automatically thinks that he ruins her standing in society. And unfortunately, with the situation in India, that is true. I started Make Love Not Scars 2.5 years ago. Make Love Not Scars started off as a college project. I was actually a fashion student and I was pursuing fashion. I was in my 3rd year of college at Leeds College of Art at the time, and I found that I had no passion for fashion. And I stumbled across a picture of an acid attack survivor in my 3rd year of college. And that kind of led me to making a documentary on the subject. So I came back to India and I started shooting this documentary. One day when I was shooting this documentary, I found myself in in a government hospital's burns ward, and it was in that ward that I kind of saw the poor health and lack of hygiene and how many people were losing their lives to burns in India, and that's when I decided to turn the documentary into an organization itself.
Okay, and one of the things you're fighting for through your organization is to basically ban the sale of this acid or the quantities of this acid that allow these attacks to happen. Help us understand why this weapon that can so quickly disfigure people so dramatically is so readily available in the country.
The government actually in 2013 regulated the states. So it was the Supreme Court that actually regulated the various states in India, and they said that they must regulate the ban on the open sale of acid. But I think we have a massive problem with implementation itself. So even though the Supreme Court has made efforts to ban the open sale of acid, the states aren't doing their bit in actually implementing that ban. So when we put up a petition to end the open sale of acid, we actually wanted the government to implement the ban and not actually ban the sale of acid, because that apparently had already happened according to the Supreme Court in 2013. With this judgment, it was amended in 2015, April of last year, but we've still not actually seen any changes. You know, it's readily available because people sell it under the disguise of bathroom cleaners, and they use it to, like, they use a bucket full of water and they dilute some acid in it, and then they use it to clean tiles and floors and marble and stuff like that. But, you know, what we're trying to prove is that there are safer alternatives, and we should adopt safer alternatives instead of acid.
How much did it mean to you to see Reshma Qureshi on the catwalk, on that runway? And then what is your message? What's the message you want to send to the public on how they should treat and respond to victims?
You know, seeing Reshma walk on the New York Fashion Week runway, I think it meant so much to me because, you know, when I first started my journey, Reshma was one of the first acid attack survivors that my organization kind of adopted, and we looked into medical, we looked into legal. So we pay for her medical treatment, we pay for her legal battle, and we also pay for her rehab. So she was one of the first survivors that I'd ever gotten in touch with. And at the time, I was 21, and I only had about 5 survivors under my care. So she was, you know, when I first met her, she was my youngest survivor. She was only 17 years old, and I was just 21. So I think just the age factor itself kind of hit very close to home. So we automatically, you know, bonded over that. And even though when I first met her, she was extremely depressed and, you know, was constantly having suicidal thoughts, I think we made it through that together. It was my first case where I actually got to, you know, be actively involved in a case right from the beginning. So I think the day we got the call that, you know, Reshma was going to be walking the ramp, I think in my head, that was it for me. I was like, she's made it. There's nothing bigger than this. And, you know, I think right before the show, we were so busy with the media and with hair and makeup, so we didn't really have time for all of it to sink in. But right after the show was done and we started seeing this news go extremely viral, I think that's when it started sinking in, and we both kind of, you know, sat down, and we still kind of didn't know what the gravity of the situation actually was. But I remember sitting down with her and we were holding hands, and we were extremely overcome with emotions. And, you know, looking back to the first day where I met her in a hospital, and looking back to backstage at New York Fashion Week, I think are two extreme, you know, comparisons. So it was phenomenal.
That was the victory for you, though, was to see her face be accepted as normal and beautiful.
Exactly, and I think that's the message we're trying to send out as well, that we can't help these girls move forward unless we get society to be more accepting. And more than anything else, these women need to move forward and come out in society in order to get employment, in order to move forward with their lives, in order to earn a livelihood. So it is so, you know, important that society starts embracing them and accepting them, and that's the only way that we're going to end the stigma that surrounds acid attacks and help these women, you know, find a new normal.
Okay, Riya Sharma, thank you so much for joining us from Mumbai. In today's Picture This, Italy has suffered a double earthquake just 2 months after deadly quakes killed around 300 people. The tremors were felt across the country, but nowhere more strongly than in the villages still recovering from the last quake. Let's take a look. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Thanks for joining us. Goodbye.